Lucia Rossi had exactly 11 minutes before the man she was lying to would notice she wasn't really looking at his paintings. She stood beneath the central chandelier of the Palazzo Moretti's grand ballroom, champagne flute untouched in her hand, badge around her neck reading Art Consultant, Lucia Rossi, in gold-embossed letters that were, technically, not a lie. She was a consultant. She simply hadn't mentioned to anyone on the guest list that the real reason she'd spent 4 months maneuvering her way onto it had nothing to do with consulting and everything to do with the 18th century Murano glass chandelier hanging 30 feet above the dance floor. She tilted her head back and studied it properly for the first time since she'd walked in. There, just below the third tier of crystal arms, half hidden by a curl of gilded bronze, a crest. Faded, scratched at some point in its 200-year life, but unmistakable. A lion holding a book, wings folded at its back. Her family's crest. The one her grandmother used to trace onto the kitchen table with her finger when she told stories about a house in Venice that didn't belong to them anymore. Lucia had seen photographs of that crest her whole life. She had never seen it in glass. Across the room, Don Matteo Moretti was rising to address his 200 guests, tapping a fork gently against his glass, in that particular way powerful men had of making silence arrive instantly, without effort. He was younger than she'd expected from his file, mid-30s, dark hair combed back, the kind of composed stillness that made a room lean toward him without knowing why. Lucia had studied his photograph for weeks. She hadn't expected the photograph to undersell him. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Matteo began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the ballroom. "This house has stood for 300 years, and it has never—" A sound cut him off. Small. Almost nothing. A single metallic groan from somewhere above the crowd. The kind of noise a building makes at night that everyone chooses to ignore. Lucia didn't ignore it. She had spent 11 years training her eyes to catch exactly this, the almost invisible shift of old iron under stress, the way a compromised bolt sheds its load fraction by fraction before it finally gives. She looked up. The anchor bolt securing the chandelier's central chain, the one that had likely been tightened by a craftsman's hand sometime around 1780, and never properly inspected since, sheared clean through. For 1 full second, nobody else in the ballroom noticed anything was wrong. The orchestra kept playing. Matteo kept speaking. 200 people in silk and tuxedos continued laughing at a joke Lucia hadn't heard, utterly unaware that 4 tons of Murano glass had just begun to fall. Lucia's body moved before her mind finished the thought. She dropped the champagne flute, didn't hear it shatter, and shoved through a wall of tailored shoulders toward the front of the room, toward the small, silver-haired woman seated closest to the dance floor, in a wheelchair pushed against a marble column, directly beneath the chandelier's widest arc. "Move!" Lucia screamed. But there wasn't time for the old woman to understand, let alone react. Lucia hit the wheelchair at a dead sprint, wrapping both arms around the woman's shoulders and hauling her sideways out of the seat with a strength she didn't know she had, dragging them both across the marble floor as the first shards began to fall like the room itself was crying glass. She felt the impact of something clipping her shoe. She didn't stop moving. The chandelier came down half a second later. Not as a graceful collapse, but as an explosion, a detonation of light and crystal that tore through the space where the wheelchair had been standing, glass raining outward in a 15-foot radius, chairs splintering, screams finally catching up to what Lucia's eyes had already understood. Silence, then. The kind that follows catastrophe. Thick, ringing, disbelieving. Lucia lay on the marble, the old woman's frail body curled protectively beneath her own, both of them breathing hard, surrounded by a glittering wreckage that had been, seconds ago, a 200-year-old family heirloom. Nonna! Matteo's voice tore through the silence, raw with something that had nothing to do with his composed stage presence. He was on the ground beside them in an instant, hands shaking as he checked his grandmother for injuries, his dark eyes flicking up to Lucia with an expression she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, suspicion, and something raw underneath both. "I'm fine, Matteo," the old woman said, her voice trembling but clear, one wrinkled hand reaching up to grip Lucia's wrist where it still lay across her shoulder. "I'm fine because of her." Nonna Bianca's fingers tightened, not out of fear this time, out of recognition. Her eyes had caught something on Lucia's hand, a slim silver signet ring, worn smooth with age, catching the scattered light of 10,000 broken crystals. A lion, wings folded, a book beneath its paw. Bianca went very still. "Where," she whispered, "did you get that ring?" Lucia opened her mouth to answer, and found, for the first time all night, that she had no lie prepared at all. Lucia never got to answer. Security swarmed the ballroom within seconds, dark suits materializing from doorways she hadn't even clocked as doors, radios crackling, guests being herded toward the exits with the practiced calm of people who had clearly done this before. Whatever question Nonna Bianca had asked about the ring dissolved into the chaos of paramedics, shattered crystal, and a household staff trying to sweep 200 years of glass off Carrara marble. By the time Lucia caught her breath, a hand had closed around her upper arm. Not rough, but not gentle either, and a voice she recognized from the podium said quietly, "Come with me." Matteo Moretti didn't wait for her to agree. He led her through a side corridor, past oil paintings that probably cost more than her apartment building, into a room that felt entirely different from the ballroom's gilded excess. Dark wood paneling, a single desk, a wall of security monitors flickering silently with feeds from every corner of the palazzo. A private study. The kind of room where business actually happened once the champagne stopped flowing. He shut the door. "Sit," he said. Not unkindly, not kindly either. Lucia sat. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, but she kept her spine straight and her chin level, the way her father had taught her before every difficult negotiation. Never let them see the fear first. Let them see the facts. Matteo remained standing, arms crossed, studying her the way she imagined he studied contracts before signing them, for the clause hidden in the fine print. "You saved my grandmother's life tonight," he said. "I should be thanking you. Instead, I find myself wondering how a woman I've never met, at a party she wasn't personally invited to, happened to be standing close enough, and fast enough, to reach her before 4 tons of glass did." "I was invited," Lucia said evenly. "Check your list. Lucia Rossi, art consultant. Brought by the Fondazione Cattaneo to assess the ballroom's period pieces ahead of the estate's insurance renewal. It's all documented." I checked already, while security was clearing the room. He tapped a folder on the desk she hadn't noticed until now. Thin, freshly printed. "Your credentials are real. Cattaneo confirms the referral. What isn't in this folder is an explanation for how a consultant who's never set foot in this palazzo before tonight identified structural failure in a chandelier 11 seconds before it happened. Fast enough to cross 40 feet of ballroom and reach my grandmother before the debris did." Lucia held his gaze. This was the part she'd rehearsed, though never quite for this audience. "I'm a certified master conservator," she said. "Glass and metalwork restoration. Trained in Florence. 12 years in the field. That chandelier's central suspension used an iron anchor bolt, not bronze. A common mistake in that era, because iron was cheaper and nobody expected the fixture to still be load-bearing 2 centuries later. Iron corrodes from the inside. It doesn't show on the surface until it's already failed. I noticed the housing had hairline rust bleed at the base when I looked up at it 20 minutes ago. I've seen that exact failure pattern before, in a church in Padua. I didn't think it would go tonight. I just didn't like the odds. For the first time since he'd shut the door, something in Matteo's expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but interest. The interest of a man who dealt in liars for a living and had just heard something that sounded, inconveniently, like the truth.
You're saying you saved my grandmother's life because of a hunch about rust. I'm saying I saved your grandmother's life because I know what I'm looking at, and most people in that room didn't.
Lucia leaned forward slightly.
You can keep interrogating me, Signor Moretti, or you can have your maintenance team pull the anchor bolts on every other fixture in this palazzo tonight, because if that chandelier failed from corrosion, it's very likely it isn't the only one.
That landed. She watched it land, the flicker of a man recalculating, weighing the cost of doubting her against the cost of being wrong. Before he could respond, the study door opened without a knock.
Nonna Bianca rolled herself in, waving off the nurse hovering behind her wheelchair with visible irritation.
Matteo, stop interrogating the girl who just saved my life and start thanking her properly.
Nonna, this isn't…
That ring.
Bianca's eyes found Lucia's hand again, steady this time, deliberate.
Show my grandson.
Lucia hesitated only a second before lifting her hand. Matteo stepped closer, studying the worn silver signet, the lion, the folded wings, the book beneath its paw. And Lucia saw the exact moment recognition passed through him too, though he clearly didn't know what he was recognizing.
That crest,
Bianca said quietly,
was carved into the stone lintel above the servants' entrance of this house, before my husband's family ever set foot in Venice. I noticed it 50 years ago and never understood why it was there. Now I do.
Matteo's jaw tightened.
Nonna, what are you saying?
I'm saying this young woman may have more claim to this house's history than either of us realized, Bianca said.
And I'm saying you'd be a fool to let her walk out of here tonight.
The silence that followed was different from the one after the crash, heavier, charged with something neither Lucia nor Matteo had a name for yet. Matteo finally exhaled, some of the guarded suspicion draining from his shoulders, replaced by something more calculating and, underneath it, unmistakably curious.
The chandelier's glass fragments need restoring, he said slowly.
And apparently my entire collection needs auditing, tonight, by someone who actually knows what she's looking at. He extended a hand, not quite an apology, not quite trust, but an opening. Consider yourself hired, Signorina Rossi. Full access to the estate, starting tomorrow. Lucia shook his hand, feeling the ring cool against her palm, and understood, with a small chill she didn't let show on her face, that she had just gotten exactly what she came for, and no idea yet what it would cost her. 3 days after the crash, Lucia stood at the prow of a private motor launch as it cut through the lagoon toward Murano, salt wind pulling loose strands of hair from the knot she'd tied that morning.
Behind her, Matteo stood with his hands loosely clasped, watching the water instead of her,
though she noticed he'd left his usual security detail behind on the dock. Just the two of them and a driver who kept a respectful distance at the wheel. "You didn't have to come yourself," Lucia said over the engine noise. "I could have sourced the silicate blends alone." "I know the foundry owner personally," Matteo said. "Old family friend. He'll open his private stock for me. For a stranger with a Cataneo letterhead, he'll sell you tourist glass and call it 18th century. A faint smile. "Consider it professional courtesy." She let that answer stand, though she suspected it wasn't the whole truth. Men like Matteo Moretti didn't personally escort consultants across a lagoon for professional courtesy. She filed the observation away and said nothing. The Seguso glass foundry sat at the edge of the island, its brick chimney trailing a thin ribbon of smoke into the gray morning sky.
Inside, the heat hit her first, the roar of the furnace,
orange light pulsing off soot-darkened walls, 3 generations of glassmakers moving around molten silica with the unhurried confidence of men who'd been doing this since they were small. Lucia felt something in her chest loosen, the way it always did in a working foundry. This was the part of her job nobody ever asked about, not the provenance disputes or the insurance paperwork, but this. Fire and sand becoming something that could outlive everyone in the room. Signorina Rossi. The foundry master, a broad man named Alvise with forearms like braided rope, greeted her with genuine warmth once Matteo introduced her. "Matteo tells me you know your bolo blends. Prove it." He handed her a shard from the fallen chandelier, wrapped carefully in cloth. Lucia turned it under the light, testing its weight, running a thumbnail along the fracture edge, holding it up to catch the furnace glow through its clouded surface. "Manganese and cobalt oxide, hand-ground, not machine-milled," she said. "Silica sourced locally, but the color additives came from Bohemia. This house was importing pigment even in the 1780s, which tells me whoever commissioned this piece wanted a specific shade of blue that Venice couldn't produce on its own." She glanced up. "You'll need to match that exactly, or the restored sections will read as newer under UV light. I can source the Bohemian pigment reference myself if your suppliers don't carry it." Alvise let out a short laugh and looked at Matteo. "She's better than the last 3 you sent me." Matteo didn't answer, but Lucia caught him watching her, with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not suspicion anymore, something quieter and more unguarded. They spent the next 2 hours moving through the foundry together, Lucia selecting blends while artisans worked molten glass beside her, gathering it on long pontels, spinning and shaping with a rhythm that looked effortless and clearly wasn't. At one point, an old craftsman handed her a blowpipe without asking whether she wanted it, simply assuming, correctly, that she did. She shaped a rough sphere under his guidance, laughing at her own clumsy first attempt, and when she looked up, Matteo was watching her from across the workshop with something close to wonder. "You're different here," he said, when she finally set the pipe down, cheeks flushed from the furnace heat. "Different how?" "In Venice, at the palazzo, you're careful. Every word measured." He leaned against a workbench, arms crossed, but his posture had lost the rigid formality she'd grown used to. "Here, you forget to be careful." Lucia wiped soot from her hands with a cloth, considering how much truth to give him.
This is the part of the work I actually love. Everything else is politics.
"I understand that better than you'd think." He looked out through the open foundry doors toward the water, and something in his face shifted, the composed mask slipping just slightly. "I was 26 when my father died. I inherited the estate, the businesses, all of it, before I'd finished deciding what I actually wanted to do with my own life. Leo was only 20. Nonna Bianca had just lost her son. Everyone needed me to already know how to be the man my father was, and I didn't. I still don't some days." It was the most unguarded thing he'd said to her since the night of the crash, and Lucia found herself surprised by how much she wanted to hear more of it.
"Nobody teaches you how to inherit a legacy," she said quietly. "You just wake up one day already responsible for it."
"Exactly." He looked at her properly then, something searching in his gaze. "You understand that. Most people around me don't. They only see the title, the money, what I can offer them. You looked at a chandelier and saw a structural flaw before you ever looked at my name."
"Should I apologize for that?"
"No." A real smile, the first she'd seen from him. "It's the reason I trust you, which is inconvenient because I don't trust easily." The foundry noise seemed to fade around them for a moment. The roar of the furnace, the artisans' voices, the distant slap of the lagoon against the dock outside. Lucia was acutely aware of how close he was standing, of the soot still on her hands, of a warmth that had nothing to do with the furnace at all.
"We should finish selecting the blends," she said,
breaking the moment before it could go further, though her voice came out softer than she intended. Yes, Matteo agreed, not moving for a second longer than necessary. We should. But as they returned to Alvise's workbench, Lucia caught him glancing at her twice more before the boat ride home, and she understood, with a small unease she couldn't quite name, that whatever she'd come to Venice to find, she was beginning to want something else entirely. The Moretti private archive occupied the ground floor of the palazzo's east wing, a windowless vault lined floor to ceiling with document boxes, ledgers, and family papers stretching back 3 centuries. Lucia had spent the better part of 2 mornings there, cataloging estate records as part of her collection audit, cross-referencing acquisition dates against the pieces she'd already assessed. It was tedious work, but it was also the work she'd actually come for. Somewhere in these boxes, if her grandmother's stories were true, there would be a record of how the palazzo's contents had changed hands during the war. She was 3 boxes deep into a shelf marked 1940 to 1946 when the vault door opened and Leo Moretti walked in without knocking. Lucia had met Matteo's younger brother only briefly, at dinner twice, both times brief and vaguely tense, Leo watching her with a wariness he made no effort to disguise. Up close, in the low archive light, that wariness had sharpened into something colder. Signorina Rossi. He said her name like it tasted wrong in his mouth. Working late. Cataloging takes time. She kept her tone neutral, closing the ledger in front of her. Your brother wants a full audit by month's end. My brother wants a lot of things lately that he didn't want 3 weeks ago. Leo crossed the room slowly, hands in his pockets, and stopped on the other side of the archive table, close enough that Lucia had to resist the urge to step back. So I did some checking of my own. Rossi. It's not a rare name in Veneto. But your particular branch of it, that took some digging. Lucia's pulse quickened, though she kept her face still. I'm not sure what you're implying. I think you know exactly what I'm implying. Leo pulled a folded paper from his jacket and set it on the table between them. A printed genealogical chart, her family's name circled in red ink, connected by a dotted line to a Venetian property record dated 1943. Your great-grandfather owned property in this parish before the war, property that, coincidentally, borders this palazzo. And now here you are, 4 months after first contacting our estate office requesting access, standing in our private archive wearing a ring that matches a crest carved into our walls. He let the silence sit, watching her. You're not a consultant, he said finally. You're building a claim. Lucia's mind raced, weighing how much to concede and how much to protect. She'd known this conversation would come eventually. She just hadn't expected it from Leo, alone, in a room with no witnesses.
I'm a certified conservator, she said carefully. Everything I've done here has been documented, professional, and above board. If my family has history connected to this estate, that's not a crime, Signor Moretti. It's a coincidence I'm still trying to understand myself.
A coincidence. Leo's laugh was short, humorless. You expect me to believe that? My grandmother nearly died, and out of 200 guests, the one person fast enough to save her happens to be wearing the crest of a family whose property vanished during the war and somehow ended up in Moretti hands. That's not a coincidence, Signorina. That's a setup.
If it were a setup, Lucia said, her voice sharpening despite herself, wouldn't I have arrived with lawyers instead of restoration tools? I didn't ask to be hired. Your brother offered.
My brother, Leo said, stepping closer, sees a beautiful, clever woman who flatters his ego and appeals to his guilt about inheriting everything too young. He's not thinking clearly where you're concerned, and I won't let this family's legacy get pulled apart because he's distracted. His voice dropped, quiet and cold, in a way that was somehow more threatening than shouting would have been. I want you gone from Venice within the week, quietly. No scandal, no scenes. If you push this, If you try to make some legal claim on anything in this house, I will make sure you regret it. I have resources my brother doesn't like to use. I won't hesitate to use them." Lucia held his gaze, refusing to let the fear show, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She had grown up hearing exactly what kind of family the Morettis were before they'd ever softened into art patrons and gala hosts. Old money built on older, darker foundations. Leo's threat wasn't idle theater. It was a promise from a man who knew precisely how to make people disappear from a problem quietly. "I'm not looking for a legal claim," she said, and to her own surprise, she meant it. Or at least, she meant it more than she had 4 months ago, before Matteo, before the foundry, before any of this had become complicated by feelings she hadn't planned for. "I came here to understand my family's history. That's all." "Then understand it from a distance," Leo said, gathering the genealogical chart back off the table, folding it with sharp, deliberate movements. "Because if I find proof that your family has any legitimate claim to what's inside this house, I promise you, I will bury it before Matteo ever sees it. This estate is not up for negotiation." He left without another word, the vault door swinging shut behind him with a heavy, final sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Lucia stood alone among the boxes, hands trembling slightly as she pressed them flat against the archive table to steady herself. Leo's threat rattled through her, but underneath the fear was something sharper, a new certainty. If Leo was this desperate to keep her away from the truth, then the truth was worth finding. Whatever proof existed of her family's ownership, whatever had really happened in 1943, it was here, buried somewhere in these boxes, and Leo clearly believed it was dangerous enough to threaten a stranger over. She looked back at the shelf, marked 1940 to 1946, at the dozen boxes she hadn't opened yet, and made a decision. She would find it before he did. The move to Tuscany came faster than Lucia expected. 3 days after her confrontation with Leo, Matteo announced over breakfast that the palazzo's ongoing structural repairs made it unsafe to keep the collection's most valuable pieces on site. Cracked plaster, exposed wiring behind the ballroom's damaged ceiling, contractors traipsing through rooms that should have stayed sealed. Villa Moretti, the family's vineyard estate outside Siena, would house the artifacts until repairs were finished. Lucia would go with them to continue the audit. She hadn't told Matteo about Leo's threat. She told herself it was because she had no proof yet, nothing concrete enough to bring to him without sounding paranoid or accusatory toward his own brother. The truer reason, the one she didn't examine too closely, was that she wasn't ready to know how he'd react, whether he'd believe her, or whether blood would win out over her word. The estate itself unfolded across rolling hills lined with cypress trees, vineyards stretching toward a horizon gone gold and rose with the setting sun by the time their car finally arrived. The villa was older than the palazzo in feeling, if not in years. Thick stone walls, terracotta roofs, the whole property steeped in a quiet that Venice's canals never allowed. Lucia felt something in her chest ease the moment she stepped out of the car, as though the weight of Leo's threat had loosened its grip, at least temporarily, in the face of so much unguarded beauty. They fell into a rhythm over the following days. Mornings were spent cataloging the relocated collection in the villa's converted stables, now lined with climate-controlled cases. Afternoons, Matteo often joined her, not out of necessity, she suspected, but because he'd stopped pretending he didn't want to. Evenings, they walked the vineyard rows together as the light faded, talking about everything except the things that actually mattered. Her family, his brother, the growing tangle of suspicion neither of them had voiced aloud. On the 8th night, Lucia found Matteo in the estate's private library, hunched over a 19th-century ledger by candlelight, a habit she'd learned he kept when sleep wouldn't come. She'd meant to simply say goodnight. Instead, she found herself crossing the room and settling into the chair beside him.
Insomnia again?
she asked.
Something like that.
He slid the ledger toward her, an inventory list from 1887, cataloging acquisitions across 3 generations. I keep coming back to these old records, trying to understand what my family actually built versus what we simply took. He glanced sideways at her, candlelight softening the usually guarded lines of his face. You've made me think about that more than I expected to. I didn't mean to complicate things for you. You didn't complicate anything. His voice had dropped, low and unguarded in a way she'd only heard once before, back at the foundry. You made me look at things I'd stopped questioning. That's not the same as complicating them. Lucia's breath caught slightly at the intensity in his gaze, the way the candlelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the careful stillness of a man choosing his next words with unusual weight.
Lucia, he said, and her name and his voice felt different than it had in any of their previous conversations. Quieter, more deliberate. I need to say something, and I don't know if it's appropriate, given everything. The audit, Leo's suspicions, my own better judgment telling me to be careful. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the night of the crash. Not just gratitude. Something else. Matteo, let me finish. His hand found hers on the ledger's open page, warm and certain. I've spent 9 years running this family, this estate, always calculating, always protecting, never allowing myself to want something simply because I wanted it. And then you walked into my ballroom and saved my grandmother's life and looked at a 200-year-old chandelier like it was the most interesting thing you'd ever seen. And I haven't been able to stop watching you since. Lucia's heart hammered against her ribs, torn between the truth she was hiding and the pull of everything she felt sitting beside him. You don't know everything about me, she said quietly, the closest she'd come yet to confessing the real reason she'd first walked into his palazzo. Then tell me, Matteo said. Whatever it is, I'd rather know the truth and choose you anyway than keep guessing in the dark. For a moment, the words hovered on her tongue. My family owned this estate before yours did. Your brother has threatened to destroy me if I dig any further. I came here looking for proof, not for you. But the moment stretched, and Lucia found she couldn't break it. Not yet. Not with his hand still holding hers and his eyes searching hers with something that looked dangerously close to trust. Later, she said instead, softer than she intended. I promise. Just not tonight. Matteo studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he sensed there was more beneath the surface than she was offering. But instead of pressing, he simply nodded, accepting the boundary she'd drawn, and reached up to brush a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that undid something in her chest completely. Later then, he said, and closed the distance between them. The kiss, when it came, was slow and certain, candlelight flickering across old ledgers and older secrets, the vineyard silent and dark beyond the library windows. Lucia let herself fall into it completely, if only for a moment, choosing not to think about deeds or threats or the truth still waiting, unspoken, in the boxes she hadn't finished searching. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would tell him everything. She didn't yet know how much that delay would cost her. Sleep never came that night. Lucia lay awake in the guest wing long after Matteo had walked her to her door, with a restraint that felt almost more intimate than the kiss itself, her mind circling the same unresolved knot it had circled for months. The deed, the war, her grandmother's stories, and now Matteo's face in candlelight, asking her to trust him with a truth she still hadn't found proof of. Around 1 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and went looking for the one thing that might finally let her stop guessing. The villa's library at night was a different creature than it had been by candlelight with Matteo beside her. Colder, quieter,
shadows pooling in the corners between towering bookshelves.
Lucia moved through it with the flashlight app on her phone, running her fingers along the spines of estate ledgers she hadn't yet catalogued, searching less with a plan than with instinct. The same instinct that had made her look up at a chandelier 3 weeks ago and know, before anyone else, that something was wrong. It was the desk that caught her attention, a heavy Renaissance writing desk pushed against the library's far wall, ornately carved, clearly older than most of the furniture around it. She'd catalogued it days earlier as a minor piece, walnut construction, 18th century restoration work visible along one leg. But now, running her palm absently along its surface while she thought, she noticed something her earlier assessment had missed, a seam in the wood grain beneath the writing surface that didn't match the desk's original construction pattern. Her conservator's instincts sharpened instantly. She knelt, examining the seam by phone light, pressing gently along its edge until she found the give, a small, recessed panel, barely a hand's width, designed to be invisible to anyone not specifically trained to look for exactly this kind of concealment. Estate desks like this one had sometimes been built with hidden compartments for important documents, deeds, letters too dangerous to keep in plain sight. She'd found 2 others in her career. She recognized the craftsmanship immediately. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked the panel loose. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, was a small bundle of papers. Lucia carried them to the reading table with a reverence that felt almost ceremonial, unwrapping the oilcloth with the careful, practiced patience of someone who had spent a career handling objects more fragile than they appeared. The papers beneath were exactly what her training told her to expect, and exactly what her heart had hoped never to actually find. An estate deed, dated 1943. The ink faded but legible, the seal at its base unmistakable even after 80 years. She read it twice before she let herself believe it. The deed named her great-grandfather, Alessandro Rossi, as the sole and rightful owner of the property now known as Villa Moretti's original parish holdings, vineyards, a smaller residence, and critically, a documented inventory of art and glasswork, including, in careful period handwriting, 1 Murano chandelier, commissioned 1781, bearing the Rossi family crest. Beneath the deed was a second document, shorter, written in a different hand, dated 1944, a wartime requisition order. Property seized under emergency wartime authority, for reasons the document didn't bother to specify, transferred into administrative custody, later, Lucia found the connecting record in the 3rd folded page, sold at what the document euphemistically called a distressed estate auction in 1946, purchased by a buyer whose name made her stomach drop even though she'd half expected it. Giovanni Moretti, Matteo's great-grandfather. Lucia sat back in the chair, the papers trembling slightly in her hands, the full weight of what she was holding finally settling over her. This wasn't ambiguous family folklore anymore, wasn't a story her grandmother had told over kitchen tables that could be dismissed as sentiment or exaggeration. This was documented proof. Her family hadn't sold this estate, hadn't abandoned it, hadn't lost it through some tragic but ordinary misfortune. It had been seized, illegally, under wartime authority that even in 1944 had no legitimate claim to private property, and later acquired by a family who likely had no idea, then or now, exactly how they'd come to own it. She thought of Matteo in the library hours earlier, candlelight on his face, telling her he'd rather know the truth and choose her anyway. She thought of Leo's cold thread in the archive vault, the genealogical chart folded sharply between his fingers, his promise to bury anything she found before his brother ever saw it. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, exactly what these papers would do if she brought them into the light. If she made this public, filed a legal claim, brought it to the authorities,
did anything with this deed beyond quietly returning it to its hiding place. It wouldn't just validate her grandmother's stories.
It would legally strip the Moretti family of one of their most prized cultural holdings, expose a wartime seizure that would attach itself to their name in every newspaper from Venice to Rome, and unravel a reputation Matteo had spent 9 years rebuilding after his father's death. It would hand Leo exactly the ammunition he'd feared she was carrying all along. Except now the danger wasn't a rumor or a coincidence. It was real, and it was sitting in her hands. Lucia looked down at the deed one more time, at her great-grandfather's careful signature, at the crest that matched the ring still on her finger, and felt the full, impossible weight of the choice now in front of her. She could bury this and walk away from the truth she'd spent months chasing, or she could tell it and destroy the man she was falling in love with. Outside the library windows, the vineyard sat silent and dark under a moonless Tuscan sky, giving her no answers at all. Lucia didn't sleep at all. By the time the first grey light crept over the vineyard hills, she'd read the deed 4 more times, memorized every line of the wartime requisition order, and still hadn't decided what to do with any of it. She'd wrapped the papers back in their oilcloth and carried them with her instead of returning them to the desk, some instinct telling her they were safer on her person than hidden in a house full of people who might have reasons to want them gone. She went to the rose garden because it was the only part of the estate she hadn't yet learned to associate with Matteo. No shared conversations there, no lingering looks, nothing to complicate the storm already going on in her head. She sat on a stone bench between rows of climbing roses just beginning to open, the morning air cool and damp, and finally let herself cry, quietly, the exhaustion of the night catching up all at once. She didn't hear the wheelchair approach until it was nearly beside her.
"You're an early riser," Nonna Bianca said, settling herself at an angle that let her study Lucia's face directly. "Or you never went to bed at all. I've seen that particular look before. Usually on people who've just discovered something they wish they hadn't." Lucia wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught. But Bianca's expression held none of the sharpness Leo's had carried in the archive vault. Only a quiet, weathered patience that made Lucia's carefully built composure crack a little further.
"I found something," Lucia admitted, before she could stop herself. "In the library. A hidden compartment in the writing desk."
Bianca's eyes moved, just slightly, to the folder Lucia held pressed against her chest, and something shifted in the old woman's face. Not surprise, Lucia realized with a small jolt. Recognition.
"May I see it?"
Lucia hesitated only a moment before handing the folder over. Bianca opened it with steady hands that belied her age, scanning the deed, the requisition order, the auction record, her expression unreadable as she absorbed documents she had clearly, somehow, already known existed.
"I wondered,"
Bianca said finally, closing the folder gently,
"whether these still existed. I hoped they did, and I feared they did, in equal measure." "You knew."
Lucia's voice came out barely above a whisper.
"You knew about this." "Not the exact papers, but I knew the shape of the truth they contained."
Bianca set the folder in her lap, her gaze drifting toward the vineyard rows beyond the garden wall, somewhere far away in memory.
"My father, Matteo's great-great-grandfather, hid your ancestors during the worst of the occupation. Alessandro Rossi and his family, in the cellar beneath what's now the estate's wine storage, for nearly 8 months. My father never spoke of it openly, not even to my mother, but I found out as a girl, listening at doors."
Lucia stared at her, the story reshaping itself in real time, more complicated and more human than the simple villain and victim version she'd carried in her head for months.
"Then how did the estate end up seized?"
Then sold. Bianca's mouth tightened.
The wartime authorities didn't care whose family had hidden whom. They seized property from anyone whose name appeared on the wrong list. And your great-grandfather's name appeared on that list because he'd been sheltering people the regime wanted found. My father tried to buy it back after the war, to return it quietly, but by then Giovanni, my husband's father, had already purchased it at that terrible auction, believing, as far as I know, that it was a legitimate transaction. He never knew the property had been stolen rather than sold. The records that would have told him were buried, deliberately, by people on both sides who wanted the whole ugly chapter to disappear along with the war itself. Why bury it, if your father knew the truth? Because the truth, in those years, could get people finished just as easily as silence could. Bianca's voice softened, some of the old iron in it giving way to something closer to grief. My father protected your family once, at enormous risk to his own. After the war, protecting the secret felt like the only way left to protect both families from a world still hungry for someone to blame. He died believing he'd done the right thing. I've spent 70 years wondering if he had. Lucia sat with that for a long moment, the roses around them stirring faintly in the morning breeze, the weight in her chest shifting from anger into something more complicated. Grief, mostly, for two families tangled together by choices made under circumstances neither of them had controlled. Matteo doesn't know any of this, she said finally.
No, Bianca agreed.
He inherited this estate believing, as his father did, and his father before him, that it came to this family cleanly. He has spent 9 years carrying guilt for sins he doesn't even know exist. Can you imagine what it will cost him to learn the truth from a stranger? Or worse, from a courtroom or a headline? So you're telling me to bury it, like your father did? I'm telling you, Bianca said, reaching out to take Lucia's hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm, that my father's silence protected no one in the end. It only delayed the reckoning by 70 years and handed it to you and my grandson instead. I watched him fall for you these past weeks, Lucia. I watched the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is paying attention. He deserves better than a secret, and so do you. He might hate me, Lucia whispered. For all of it. For not telling him sooner. He might, Bianca said honestly. But he'll hate you far more if he learns you knew and said nothing at all. Tell him the truth, whatever it costs. Some debts are better paid in daylight than left buried in the dark, waiting to collapse on someone who never saw it coming. Lucia looked down at the folder in Bianca's lap, then out at the vineyard rows catching their first full light of morning, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for months. She would tell him. Today. She just didn't yet know that she would never get the chance. Lucia found Matteo just before noon, standing at the edge of the vineyard with his phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight in a way she hadn't seen since the night of the crash. She waited at a distance, folder clutched against her chest, rehearsing the words she'd practiced in the rose garden a dozen times already. When he finally lowered the phone, she stepped forward.
Matteo, I need to talk to you. It's important.
It has to wait. He was already moving toward the house, distracted in a way that made her stomach tighten.
That was the palazzo's head of security. There's been an incident with the collection.
What kind of incident?
The restored chandelier pieces, 3 of the paintings we relocated last week.
He raked a hand through his hair, jaw tight.
They're gone. Removed from the climate storage in Florence, sometime overnight. No alarm triggered, no forced entry. Whoever took them had access codes.
Lucia's pulse spiked. Leo. Matteo stopped walking and looked at her sharply. What do you know? She hesitated only a second, the confession about the deed still sitting unsaid in her chest, competing now with an urgency that couldn't wait. He threatened me. Weeks ago,
in the archive vault. He accused me of trying to build a legal claim on the estate. He told me to leave Venice quietly
or he'd make sure I regretted staying. Matteo's face went pale, then hard.
Why didn't you tell me this immediately?
I didn't have proof. I didn't want to accuse your brother of something I couldn't back up. The words felt thin even as she said them, and she watched something in Matteo's trust flicker, just slightly, at the admission.
I'm telling you now.
Now might be too late. He was already dialing, barking instructions to his driver, to his security chief, his composed exterior cracking under something closer to panic than Lucia had ever seen from him.
Leo flew to Florence this morning, told my assistant it was a supplier meeting for the vineyard's export contracts. If he's moved the collection, then he's planning to sell it, Lucia finished,
the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Before anyone can make a legal claim on it, before I could. Matteo's eyes met hers, and for one terrible moment she saw him weighing her words against his brother's blood, deciding, in real time, which loyalty would win. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. We're going to Florence. Now. The drive took 90 minutes that felt like 9 hours, Matteo silent behind the wheel, knuckles white on the steering wheel, Lucia beside him, running through everything she knew and hadn't yet told him. The deed, the requisition order, Bianca's confession in the rose garden, all of it crowding her throat, unspoken, because there was no room left in the car for anything but the immediate crisis unfolding ahead of them. They reached the private hangar at Florence's regional airport just as the sun began sliding toward late afternoon, security gates standing open in a way that made Matteo's expression turn to stone. Inside, a cargo plane sat with its loading ramp down, crates stacked along the tarmac, and standing among them, phone to his ear, was Leo, mid-conversation with someone Lucia didn't recognize, gesturing sharply at a man in an unfamiliar uniform overseeing the loading. Lucia didn't think. She walked straight toward the crates, scanning their markings, and found what she was looking for on the third one, a shipping label bearing a name she recognized from her months of research into black market art circulation. Dmitry Volkov, a dealer with a reputation for moving contested pieces through international auction loopholes before ownership disputes could catch up to them.
You're selling to Volkov, she said, loud enough to cut through Leo's phone call. You're not protecting the estate. You're liquidating it before I can prove anything.
Leo lowered his phone slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something colder as he registered her presence, and behind her, Matteo's. Lucia. His voice had lost all pretense of civility. You should have left Venice when I told you to. Leo. Matteo's voice came out low, dangerous, a register Lucia hadn't heard from him before.
What is this?
Damage control, Leo said, not backing down, gesturing at the crates around them with a kind of desperate certainty. She's building a claim, Matteo. I found the genealogy weeks ago. If she proves this family stole that estate, we lose everything. The chandelier, the paintings, the collection our great-grandfather built. I'm not going to stand by and let a stranger destroy everything our family has left. So I'm moving the pieces somewhere she can't touch them, somewhere no court can freeze mid-dispute.
You're stealing from our own family, Matteo said, to sell it to a man who launders provenance for a living?
I'm saving what's left of it, Leo shot back, before she takes it all. Lucia stepped closer, some of the careful diplomacy she'd maintained for weeks finally giving way to something sharper.
I'm not trying to take anything, Leo. I was trying to tell him the truth this morning before your brother's phone rang with news that you'd already run off with half our collection.
Your truth, Leo spat, would have ruined us either way. Something in his face shifted then, a calculation Lucia recognized a half-second too late. He nodded once at the man in the unfamiliar uniform, who moved quickly, cutting off her retreat toward Matteo with practiced efficiency. Before she could react, 2 hands closed around her arms from behind, hauling her back toward an empty steel shipping container at the edge of the tarmac.
Leo!
Matteo lunged forward, but Leo's men were already between them,
buying precious seconds.
"I'm sorry, Matteo," Leo said, and for just a moment his voice cracked with something that sounded almost like regret. "But I can't let her stop this. Not now. Not when we're this close to making it disappear."
The container door slammed shut behind Lucia with a hollow, metallic finality, plunging her into total darkness, her fists already pounding uselessly against steel walls as she heard, muffled and distant, the sound of the cargo plane's engines beginning to spin up outside. Inside the container, the darkness was absolute. Lucia pressed her palms flat against the cold steel, forcing her breathing to slow, forcing the panic clawing at her throat back down into something she could think through. She'd survived a falling chandelier by trusting her instincts. She wasn't going to fall apart now, locked in a box on a tarmac, just because the danger had changed shape.
She banged against the walls, shouted until her voice went raw, and stopped only when she registered the growing whine of jet engines outside, a sound that told her, with a cold certainty, that shouting wasn't going to save her. Leo needed her contained for minutes, not hours. Just long enough to get the plane loaded and airborne, the collection gone before anyone official could intervene. Outside, Matteo was doing the math far faster than his brother had accounted for. The moment the container door slammed shut, something in him went cold and clear in a way it hadn't been since he was 26 years old, standing over his father's casket and realizing an entire family now depended on decisions he wasn't ready to make. He shoved past the man blocking his path, ignoring the shout behind him, and sprinted toward the hangar's security office, where a bank of monitors fed from cameras across the property.
"Lock down the runway," he barked at the stunned attendant inside. "Nothing leaves this airfield. Call the tower. Tell them there's a security override on outbound cargo flight."
He glanced at the manifest pinned to the wall. "Papa Sierra 421, now." The attendant scrambled to comply, and Matteo was already moving again, phone pressed to his ear, dialing his head of security with hands that were, for the first time in years, visibly shaking. "Track Leo's phone, now. I don't care what it costs, I want a location in 90 seconds. He found the container 3 minutes later, tucked behind a maintenance building at the edge of the tarmac, far enough from the loading zone that a casual search wouldn't have caught it. He didn't wait for tools. He grabbed a tire iron from an idle luggage cart and drove it into the container's locking mechanism with a force that came from somewhere far past reason, past composure, past every careful, measured instinct he'd spent 9 years cultivating. The door gave with a shriek of metal, and Lucia stumbled forward into blinding daylight and his waiting arms. "And here," Matteo said, voice breaking as he pulled her against him, one hand cradling the back of her head like he was checking she was real. "I'm here. I've got you." "Leo," Lucia gasped, still catching her breath. "The plane isn't going anywhere." His jaw tightened, some of the panic in his expression hardening into fury. "Stay here, please." She didn't stay. She followed him back across the tarmac, legs still unsteady, arriving in time to see Leo standing frozen at the base of the cargo ramp, security personnel closing in from 3 directions, the loading crew backing away from crates they suddenly understood far too well not to touch. "It's over, Leo," Matteo said, his voice carrying flat and hard across the tarmac. "The runway's locked. Nobody's flying anywhere." "Matteo, listen to me!" Leo's composure, so cold and certain inside the hangar, cracked open now, panic bleeding through. "I did this for the family, for you. If she proves that claim, we lose everything. Don't you understand that? I was trying to save what's left before the courts could freeze it, before—" "You locked her in a shipping container." Matteo's voice dropped, quieter now, which somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have. "You were going to leave her there while you sold our history to a man who launders stolen art for a living. Do you have any idea what would have happened if the plane had taken off with her still inside that thing?" Leo's face went white. I told them to release her once we were airborne. I wasn't going to—
You don't get to tell me your intentions, Matteo cut him off.
Not after this. I don't care what fear drove you to it. You crossed a line I can't forgive, and I won't pretend otherwise to protect you. Lucia watched the two brothers face each other across the tarmac. Years of complicated loyalty and grief and inherited responsibility compressed into a silence neither of them seemed able to break first. Leo's shoulders finally sagged, whatever fight had carried him this far draining out of him all at once. "What happens now?" he asked quietly.
Now you have no authority over the estate's accounts, the collection, or anything requiring my signature, Matteo said. Effective immediately. You'll return every piece you moved, and you'll cooperate fully with whatever investigation follows, or I hand this entire situation to the authorities myself, brother or not. His voice softened just slightly, the anger giving way to something more exhausted. I understand you were afraid, Leo. I understand you thought you were protecting something. But you nearly destroyed a woman's life to do it, and I won't pretend that's a mistake I can simply forgive because we share a name. Leo said nothing, defeat settling over him as security moved in to secure the crates, to begin the slow process of reversing what he'd set in motion. Matteo turned back to Lucia, some of the hardness in his expression melting into something raw and unguarded, his hand finding hers and holding on like he needed the contact to fully believe she was safe. I meant what I said earlier. I'm going to recover every single piece he tried to sell. Every painting, every fragment. I swear it. Lucia looked at him, at the man who had just broken open a steel container with his bare hands and a tire iron, who had chosen her over his own brother's version of loyalty without a moment's hesitation, and felt the confession she'd been carrying for 2 days rise back into her throat, more urgent now than ever.
"Matteo,"
she said quietly.
"There's something I still need to tell you. Something I should have told you this morning, before any of this happened."
His eyes searched hers, steady despite everything the day had cost him.
"Tell me now."
And finally, standing on a tarmac still humming with adrenaline and the wreckage of his brother's betrayal, Lucia began to explain about the deed. Matteo listened to the whole story without interrupting once. The deed, the requisition order, the auction record bearing his great-grandfather's name, Nonna Bianca's confession in the rose garden that morning. Lucia watched his face carefully as she spoke, braced for anger, for the same defensive fury she'd seen him level at his brother 20 minutes earlier. Instead, when she finally finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the tarmac where security still worked to secure the crates Leo had tried to steal. You could have told me any time in the last 2 days, he said finally. Instead, you carried this alone.
I was afraid of exactly what almost happened today, Lucia admitted. That the truth would cost you everything, and that you'd hate me for being the one who brought it.
I could never hate you for the truth, Lucia.
He turned to face her fully, something steady and certain settling into his expression, despite the exhaustion of the day.
I've spent my whole life inheriting things I didn't fully understand. If part of what I inherited was built on a wrong done to your family, I'd rather know it and make it right than keep living inside a lie because it was more comfortable. He took her hand. We'll figure out what that means together. But right now we have a more immediate problem. The immediate problem had a name, Dmitry Volkov, and according to the shipping manifests Leo's security detail had confiscated from the hangar, one piece from the original collection. A Caravaggio-attributed painting, long rumored among collectors but never publicly confirmed, had already left the country 3 days earlier, before Leo's larger theft attempt, quietly consigned to an exclusive black-tie auction happening that very night at the Palazzo Corsini in Florence. If it sells tonight, Matteo said, already moving toward the car, phone pressed to his ear arranging invitations, it disappears into a private collection somewhere with a scrubbed provenance record. We'll never trace it again.
They arrived at the Corsini auction hall 2 hours later, Lucia in a borrowed gown that didn't quite fit and didn't matter, Matteo beside her in the same suit he'd worn since morning, both of them running on adrenaline and very little sleep.
The auction room glittered with old money and older secrets, crystal chandeliers throwing soft light across velvet ropes and hushed, appraising conversation. A bitter echo, Lucia thought, of the ballroom where all of this had started 3 weeks earlier. The painting appeared as Lot 14, unveiled on a raised platform under gallery lighting, catalogued simply as Italian School, 17th Century, Private Collection. Lucia recognized it instantly from the audit photographs she'd taken weeks earlier. The same brushwork, the same faint restoration scarring along the lower left corner she'd documented in her own conservation notes.
"That's it," she murmured to Matteo. "That's the piece."
The bidding opened at 400,000 euros and climbed fast, paddles rising across the room, the auctioneer's rhythm building toward a sale that would take the painting permanently out of reach. Lucia felt the seconds slipping away and did the only thing she could think to do. She stood.
"Excuse me,"
she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed auction hall, drawing every eye in the room, including the auctioneer's startled gaze.
"Before this lot sells, the room should know this painting was stolen, illegally seized from a Venetian family in 1944, sold under coercion in a wartime auction, and it has never had a clean chain of title since. I have documentation. The original 1943 deed, the wartime requisition order, and archival photographs matching this exact piece. And I'm formally disputing this sale on behalf of the original owning family."
A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, paddles lowering, the auctioneer glancing anxiously toward hall security. "This is outrageous," a voice cut in. Dmitry Volkov himself, rising from his seat near the front, sharp-suited and visibly furious. "Baseless accusations, unsupported by any real evidence."
"I have the evidence right here," Lucia said, holding up the folder she'd carried with her since Tuscany, and beside her, Matteo rose as well, his presence lending an authority the room clearly recognized.
"I'm Matteo Moretti," he said, his voice carrying the same effortless command Lucia had first witnessed at his own gala weeks earlier, though this time aimed entirely at protecting rather than performing. "My family currently holds legal title to the estate this piece originated from. I can confirm the provenance dispute Signorina Rossi is raising is legitimate, and I'm formally withdrawing my family's consent for this sale to proceed under contested title." The room erupted into low, urgent conversation, the auctioneer conferring hurriedly with hall officials, while Volkov argued, increasingly red-faced, with a security team now flanking him on either side. Lucia felt Matteo's hand find hers, steadying, as the two of them stood united against a room that had, moments earlier, been prepared to let a stolen piece of her family's history vanish forever into private hands. It took nearly 40 minutes to resolve. Officials, lawyers summoned by phone, the auction house's own legal counsel poring over Lucia's documentation with growing unease as its authenticity became undeniable. But by the time the dust settled, the lot was formally withdrawn from sale, Volkov's consignment privileges suspended pending investigation into how he'd acquired stolen wartime property in the first place, and the painting itself placed into temporary custodial holding pending resolution of ownership between the Rossi and Moretti families.
"We did it,"
Lucia said, still catching her breath as they finally stepped out into the cool night air outside the Corsini, the auction hall's glittering chaos fading behind them.
"We actually did it."
"We did," Matteo agreed, turning to face her fully under the soft light of the palazzo's exterior lamps, exhaustion and something like wonder mixing in his expression. "Though I suspect this is only the beginning of untangling everything. The truth is about to change."
"Are you frightened of that?"
"No." He reached up, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, with the same gentleness she remembered from the library in Tuscany,
a lifetime ago, and only 10 days earlier. For the first time in a long while, I'm not frightened of the truth at all. I think, strangely, I'm grateful for it. Behind them, the auction house lights glittered against the Florence night, the painting safe, the collection recovered, Leo's betrayal contained. And ahead of them, though neither said it aloud yet, the far harder conversation still waiting. What it would actually mean for both their families to finally build something honest out of everything the past had tried to bury. 3 weeks after the chandelier fell, Lucia stood once again beneath its restored arc, watching afternoon light fracture through newly fitted crystal and catch, faintly, on the small blue-tinted panels she'd personally selected at Alvise's foundry. Glass ground from the exact bohemian pigment blend her great-grandfather had once imported, matched so precisely that no expert eye would ever find the seam between old and new. The ballroom had been fully repaired, plaster patched, marble repolished, until it held no memory of shattered crystal or screaming guests. But Lucia knew better than most that restoration didn't mean forgetting what had broken. It meant understanding it well enough to make it whole again, without pretending the crack had never happened. The gathering tonight was smaller than the gala 3 weeks earlier. No orchestra, no 200 guests, just close family and a handful of lawyers and cultural ministry officials who'd spent the intervening weeks helping untangle 80 years of buried paperwork into something workable. Nonna Bianca sat near the front in her wheelchair, dressed in deep green silk, watching the proceedings with an expression of quiet satisfaction that Lucia had come to recognize as the old woman's particular version of triumph. Leo stood near the back of the room, present but subdued, stripped of operational authority over the estate's accounts, as Matteo had promised. Working now under the terms of a probation neither brother spoke about openly, but both seemed, slowly, to be finding their way through. He caught Lucia's eye across the room and gave her a small, genuine nod. Not quite an apology spoken aloud, but something closer to one than she'd expected to ever receive from him.
"Thank you all for coming," Matteo said, rising to address the room, his voice carrying the same easy command it had the night the chandelier fell, though everything underneath it had changed completely. 3 weeks ago, in this exact room, I began a speech I never finished. I'd like to finish it now. He paused, glancing briefly at Lucia before continuing. "This house has stood for 300 years, and for most of that time, my family believed our claim to it was clean. We were wrong. In 1943, the estate this palazzo now includes, its vineyards, a portion of its collection, and this chandelier itself, was stolen from the Rossi family under wartime seizure, then sold, without their consent, to my own great-grandfather. He likely never knew the truth of how he came to own it. I only learned it 3 weeks ago, from the woman who saved my grandmother's life, and then had the courage to tell me something that could have cost her everything to say." Murmurs moved through the small gathering, though most of those present already knew what was coming. The story had moved through legal channels and quiet negotiations for weeks now, carefully, deliberately, away from the kind of public scandal that could have destroyed reputations on both sides. "Rather than fight this in court, rather than let lawyers decide what belongs to whom," Matteo continued, "the Rossi and Moretti families have agreed on something better. Effective today, the historical collection of this estate, the artwork, the chandelier, the vineyard holdings connected to the original 1943 deed, will be placed under joint stewardship. A foundation, co-owned and co-governed by both families, dedicated to preserving this collection's history honestly, including the parts of that history we'd rather forget." He looked toward Nonna Bianca, who nodded once, her eyes bright with something that looked, from where Lucia stood, remarkably like relief, 70 years in the making. "My grandmother's father hid Lucia's family during the worst of the occupation, at enormous personal risk. Decades later,
My family unknowingly benefited from the same regime that made that risk necessary in the first place. I can't undo what happened, none of us can, but I can make sure it's never buried again. And I can make sure the two families this history connects are finally standing on the same side of it instead of opposite ones. He turned fully toward Lucia now, and something in the room shifted, the formal proceedings giving way to something more personal, more unguarded.
"There's one more thing," Matteo said, and Lucia felt her breath catch as he crossed the short distance between them, taking both her hands in his beneath the glowing chandelier they'd fought so hard to protect. "Lucia Rossi walked into my life the night this chandelier came down, and in every way that's mattered since, she hasn't stopped catching me before I fell. She found the truth I didn't know I needed. She stood in an auction hall and fought for a piece of history most people would have let disappear. She trusted me with something that could have destroyed everything I have, and I've never once regretted that she did." He reached into his jacket and produced a small leather folder. Not a ring box, Lucia realized with a startled laugh, but something else entirely. An official partnership document, freshly signed, naming her co-director of the newly formed Rossi Moretti Cultural Foundation. "This is yours," he said. "Not as a gift, as what you've earned. Every piece in this collection will carry your name alongside mine from now on, in the records and in the credit, exactly as it should." Lucia took the folder, hands trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the weight of everything it represented. Not just recognition, but a truth finally standing in daylight, honored rather than buried.
"And," Matteo added, quieter now, just for her, though the whole room could still hear it, "I'm asking you to stay, not just as the Foundation's co-director, and not just as the curator who saved this collection twice over. I'm asking you to stay as my partner in every sense of the word, in this work and in my life." Lucia looked up at him, at the chandelier glowing softly above them both, restored to wholeness by hands that understood exactly what it had cost to break and what it took to mend, and felt the last of the fear she'd carried since that first night finally loosen its grip entirely. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "I'll stay." Above them, the Murano glass caught the last of the evening light, its restored crystal arms glowing gold, a family crest hidden in its curves finally seen, finally honored, finally home.